Have you ever stood before a mirror, staring into your own eyes until the edges of your vision began to blur, thinking, if I just put on this dress, everything will be lighter? Have you ever bargained with a reflection? What if the fabric, the weave of the silk, the specific shade of the dye, the way the cut drapes over a hip or a shoulder, could actually act as a seal? What if you could dress yourself in something so undeniably beautiful that it would dazzle the world into blindness, ensuring that not a single soul could notice that beneath the silk and the skin, you are actually screaming, I thought so. I truly, desperately believed it. I bought that dress. It was a pale, gentle pink, the color of a sunrise you see after staying awake all night. It had an open back and a skirt that moved like liquid, like water cascading over stones. I remember the day I bought it. I held it in my hands not as a garment, but as a lifeline, clutching the hanger until my knuckles turned white. I tried it on in the dressing room, turning this way and that, whispering to the glass, convincing myself, at graduation, I will be different. When I zip this up, I will be free. But the dress didn't save me. That night, the University of North Carolina campus was alive, vibrating with an energy that felt electric and overwhelming. The ancient oak trees were strung with lights. The brick walkways teemed with life. Graduates were laughing, that open mouth, carefree sound of people who believe the world is theirs. They were hugging, the flashbulbs of cameras popping like distant fireworks. And amidst all that motion, all that triumphant noise, I stood paralyzed in the corner of the great hall, feeling my own body betray me. Do you know what it is like to be surrounded by a sea of people, yet feel like you are trapped in a glass box that is slowly filling with water? It is the sensation of absolute isolation in the middle of a crowd. It is as if every glance thrown in your direction is a physical blow, a strike against bruised skin. It is as if every sound, the clinking of glasses, the scrape of a chair, a sudden shout, is a trigger, a wire pulled in the dark. It feels as if you are not you anymore. You are just a shell, a porcelain casing that is developing hairline fractures, terrified that if you move, you will shatter on the floor. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, like syrup. I couldn't move my legs. They felt heavy, rooted to the floorboards. I simply couldn't be there. And it was all because of what had happened 2 years ago. I hadn't told anyone, not a soul. I had tried to perform an impossible surgery on my own mind. I tried to excise the memory, to forget it, to scrub it away like a stubborn stain of red wine on a favorite white shirt. I scrubbed and scrubbed until the fabric of my mind was threadbare, but the stain didn't fade. It wasn't on the surface. It had soaked through. It had eaten into my skin, woven itself into my neural pathways, settled into the rhythm of my breathing. I had convinced myself that graduation was a period, a full stop, the end of the sentence, a new beginning. But standing there, clutching a glass I couldn't drink from, I realized graduation wasn't a door out. It was a mirror. It showed me, with cruel clarity, that I was still there, in that room, in that night, wrapped in that cold, suffocating fear. Have you ever tried to outrun a memory that lives inside your own ribcage? I tried. God, I tried. And I want to tell you how it felt. Not because I am looking for your pity. Pity is a heavy blanket that suffocates more than it warms. I want to tell you because perhaps you are wearing your own version of the dress that didn't save you. Maybe you are standing in a corner of your own life, waiting for the moment when the weight lifts and everything becomes lighter. I will tell you how I dragged myself to that night, how I exhausted myself trying to be normal, how I perfected the art of the smile while the foundations of my soul were crumbling into dust. And I will tell you how, on that graduation night, amidst the confetti and the lies, I finally understood something profound. To become truly free, you have to stop pretending you aren't bleeding. This is a story about the pain that leaves no bruises. It is about a dress that failed to be armor. And it is about a girl who decided, finally, to break the silence. My name is Madison. I was born and raised here in North Carolina, in a small town not far from Charlotte, one of those places where the summers are humid and slow, and everyone knows the sound of everyone else's car engine. When I was accepted into college, it didn't feel like just a geographical move. It felt like stepping onto a different planet. The campus was a dreamscape of red brick buildings covered in ivy, a library that smelled of old paper and floor wax, rowdy student nights that spilled onto the lawns, and football matches where the war of the stadium seemed to shake the sky. I had dreamed, with the fierce optimism of 18, that these years would be the golden era of my life. And at first, they were exactly that. It was picture perfect. I made friends who felt like family. I joined clubs. I buried myself in studies. I excelled. My favorite thing was to sit on the wide stone steps of the campus library in the evenings, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges. I would listen to the hum of students laughing, the distant strum of a guitar, and I would think, I am here. I have finally found my place in the world. But then, one night, the axis of my world shifted. It happened at a party in a dormitory. It was a night like any other. Music thumping through the floorboards, the sharp scent of cheap vodka and line, laughter bouncing off the cinder block walls. I don't want to dissect the anatomy of that night. I don't want to give it more power than it already has. But that evening, I endured something that tore a hole in the fabric of who I was. Violence. It is a small word, 3 syllables, but it felt like a stone lodged in my throat for 2 years. It was an event I tried to edit out of my history, deleting the file from my brain, but the system kept restoring it. After that night, the molecular structure of Madison changed. I stopped trusting. The world, which had seemed so open and inviting, suddenly bristled with hidden dangers. I lost the ability to feel safe. If someone brushed past me in the cafeteria, just a sleeve against a sleeve, I would flinch as if burned. Loud noises didn't just startle me, they sent a jolt of adrenaline through my veins that left my hands shaking for an hour. I began to shrink. I avoided parties. Then I avoided large groups. Then I avoided simple coffee dates. At first, I told myself this was temporary. It will pass, I thought. Time heals all wounds. That's what they say, isn't it? But time, I learned, is not a healer. Time is just a medium. Without treatment, time didn't heal the wound, it allowed it to fester. It made the infection go deeper, reaching the bone. I started noticing the flashbacks. They were intrusive and violent. I could be sitting in a lecture hall, listening to a professor drone on about European history, and suddenly, snap, I wasn't there anymore. I was back in that room. A smell, a shadow, a specific quality of light would hijack my brain. My body would react before my mind could catch up. My heart would hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird. My breath would hitch and shallow. My hands would tremble uncontrollably beneath the desk. I became a master of concealment. I plastered a smile on my face that didn't reach my eyes. I told my friends I was just tired, just stressed about finals. I pretended everything was fine, but inside I felt like I was slowly dissolving, like sand slipping through an hourglass. When graduation approached, I made a decision. This ceremony would be my exorcism. It would be my new start. I went out and bought that dress, the pale pink one with the open back. I looked at it hanging in my closet and thought, this dress is a symbol. I will wear it, and when I walk across that stage, everyone will see that I am strong. They will see that I survived. I tried it on again and again in the weeks leading up to the ceremony. I would stand before the mirror, turning, posing, trying to force my reflection to look happy. But every time I met my own eyes in the glass, a small, cruel voice whispered from the back of my mind, "You haven't survived anything. You are still there. You are still broken." I knew graduation would be a gauntlet. The crushing crowds, the loud music, the demand to be joyful, the relentless flash of cameras, it was a minefield of triggers. But I decided I had to go, because not going was an admission of defeat. Because graduation is a symbol, and I needed a symbol to hold on to. I wanted to believe the dress would save me. I wanted to believe that silk could serve as armor against memories. But deep down, in the quiet dark of my room, I knew no amount of fabric can hide pain that lives in the marrow. And yet, I went. I truly thought I could handle it. I clung to the naive hope that the calendar pages turning were equivalent to distance traveled. I thought the memories would eventually lose their sharp edges and dissolve like smoke in a strong wind. But trauma doesn't fade, it waits. After that night in the dorm, I began to realize that my body was no longer my own. It had developed a mind, a memory, and a defense system entirely separate from my conscious will. I could be sitting in a sunlit classroom, pen poised over a notebook, listening to a lecture on behavioral psychology, and suddenly, a flash, a glitch in reality. I wasn't in the classroom. I was there. The bass of the music, the cloying smell of stale alcohol and sweat, the weight of hands that weren't mine. I would freeze, my muscles locking up, my heart beating so loudly I was convinced the student next to me could hear it thumping like a war drum. In the beginning, these episodes were sporadic, like thunderstorms in summer, but gradually the weather changed. The storms became the climate. I remember one specific morning vividly. I was walking across the UNC campus. It was a glorious spring morning. The dogwoods were in bloom, white petals drifting onto the brick paths like snow. Students were rushing to class, balancing coffees, laughing, complaining about exams. It was the picture of collegiate idyll. And then from behind me, I heard a burst of loud, raucous laughter from a group of guys. It was just laughter, just a joke shared between friends. But to my nervous system, it was a threat assessment. It was the sound of that night. My legs turned to water. My lungs seized. The world tilted on its axis. I stopped in the middle of the path, fighting the urge to collapse, while every instinct in my reptilian brain screamed, "Run!" I forced myself to walk, my movements stiff and mechanical, until I reached the nearest empty lecture hall. I slipped inside and sat in the back row, headed in the shadows. I clamped my hands onto my knees to stop them from shaking, staring at the blank chalkboard. No one noticed. No one ever noticed. I was screaming in silence, and the world just kept walking by. Another time, I was in the library. The air was still and smelled of dust. I was studying for finals, lost in a textbook. Suddenly, a hand landed on my shoulder. It was heavy and unexpected. I flinched so violently, I knocked my pen holder off the table, the plastic clattering loudly in the silence. It was just a classmate. He wanted to ask if I was done with the reference book. He looked confused, his hand hovering in the air. "Whoa, sorry," he said. My heart was racing at 200 beats a minute. My skin burned where he had touched me. I forced a smile, a rictus of politeness, and said, "It's fine. You just startled me." But it was a lie. It wasn't fine. It felt like an invasion. I began to systematically excise people from my life. I stopped going to the chaotic parties on Franklin Street. I dropped out of the student clubs. I stopped accepting invitations to dinner. I told my friends I was busy, that the workload was crushing me, that I was just so tired. The truth was simpler and darker. I was afraid. I was terrified that a casual touch, a sudden shout, a specific song would teleport me back to hell. My disorder became the roommate I couldn't evict. I woke up at 3 a.m., tangled in sheets, damp with sweat, escaping nightmares where the loop played over and over. I sat in lectures, staring at the professor's mouth moving, hearing nothing but the rush of blood in my ears. I smiled in photos, but if you looked closely, my eyes were dead. There was a hollowness there that frightened me. I tried to fight back. I filled journals with frantic writing. I ran on the treadmill until my lungs burned. I downloaded meditation apps and tried to breathe through the panic, but nothing worked. The monster was too big, and I was too small. I looked at my pink ties hanging on the door and thought, it will save me. It has to. But the rational part of my brain knew better. No fabric is thick enough to hide that kind of damage. This was the first turning point. The moment I realized that my trauma wasn't just a memory I could repress, it had become a system. It had rewritten my biology. It was part of me now, and graduation was going to be the ultimate test. Could I pretend well enough to survive? Graduation evening arrived, heavy with humidity and expectation. The University of North Carolina campus was ablaze with lights, as if the town itself was determined to burn away the darkness for our transition into adulthood. The red brick buildings, usually so stoic, were draped in garlands. White tents dotted the main quad. serving sparkling cider and hors d'oeuvres. From inside the main hall, the thumping bass of a live band and the roar of 1,000 voices spilled out into the night. I arrived early, encased in my pale pink dress. It fit perfectly. The silk was cool against my skin, the open back daring and elegant, the fabric flowing around my legs with every step. I had spent an hour in front of the mirror before leaving, applying mascara with a steady hand, whispering the mantra, "Today I am different. Today I am free." But the moment I crossed the threshold into the hall, the illusion shattered. My body reacted instantly. The sheer density of the crowd, students, parents, professors, alumni, hit me like a physical wall. They were laughing, shouting over the music, hugging, invading each other's personal space. The lights were too bright, dazzling, and sharp. The acoustics were a nightmare. The noise didn't just enter my ears, it vibrated in my teeth. I tried to play the role. I accepted a flute of champagne I had no intention of drinking. I nodded at girlfriends, I complimented shoes. But beneath the surface, the anxiety was rising like floodwater. My heart rate accelerated, thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs. My breath grew short, shallow, insufficient. "Madison, you look absolutely stunning." It was Sarah, my roommate. She was beaming, flushed with excitement. I pulled my lips back into a shape that resembled a smile. "Thank you," I said. My voice sounded tinny, distant, as if it were coming from someone else standing 3 feet away. Inside, a voice was screaming, "You are not safe. You cannot handle this. You should not be here." A photographer was weaving through the crowd, corralling groups for candid shots. I saw the flashbulb pop, a blinding white explosion, and I knew the group photo was coming. That was my nightmare. Standing shoulder to shoulder, trapped in a mass of bodies, unable to escape, I needed air. I excused myself, turned away from the moments I hit and I left fire, high temperature, and fired down close to the room from a forest. "Count to 10, I told myself. "Name 5 things you see." But the anxiety didn't recede. It hovered, waiting. I felt porous, defenseless. I knew that any touch, any wrong sound, could send me spiraling back to that night in the dorm. And then, when I forced myself back into the hall, it happened. I was navigating the edge of the dance floor. A guy, laughing with his friends, stumbled slightly and brushed past me. His hand landed on my bare back just for a second to steady himself. It was an innocuous gesture, accidental, meaningless. But to me, it was a match dropped into gasoline. His hand felt heavy, hot, possessive. The smell of his cologne mixed with the stale beer on his breath. I froze. Time warped, slowing down to a crawl. The hall vanished. The music worked into a grotesque drone. I wasn't at graduation anymore. I was back there. The weight, the smell, the helplessness. I couldn't breathe. My throat closed up. My vision tunneled until all I could see was a pinpoint of light. I felt my knees buckling. "Hey, are you okay?" someone asked. The voice came from underwater. I nodded violently, a jerky, unnatural motion. "Yes," I gasped. It was the biggest lie I had ever told. I took a step back, then another. The crowd felt like a cage, the bodies pressing in, the laughter mocking. The music was a physical assault. Everything was too much. I broke rank. I turned and walked away from the celebration, trying to keep my pace steady, trying not to run. I passed the dancing couples, the tables laden with food, the friends I was supposed to be celebrating with. Every step was an effort of will, wading through molasses. I reached the heavy double doors at the side of the hall. I knew if I stayed inside for one more second, I would shatter into a million pieces right there on the parquet floor. I pushed the door open and stumbled into the corridor. It was quiet here. The noise was muffled, but the panic didn't stop. It was a runaway train. I leaned against the cool plaster wall, gasping for air, trying to force oxygen into my starving lungs. But my breathing was ragged, broken. My heart was still galloping. I thought, why? Why can't I be like them? Why can't I just drink the champagne and smile and be happy? What is wrong with me? And in that lonely corridor, the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Graduation isn't a celebration for me. It is a trial. And it is a trial I am failing. I stood in that deserted corridor, my spine pressed against the unforgiving cold of the wall. feeling the absolute betrayal of my own biology. My heart wasn't just beating, it was thrashing, a wild animal throwing itself against the cage of my ribs, desperate to escape. My breathing had disintegrated into sharp, terrifying gasps, as if I were trying to suck air through a crushed straw. A single, relentless thought looped in my brain. I can't go back in there. I can't be one of them. The music from the hall bled through the walls, a muffled, rhythmic thumping. Thump, dump, ump. Each bass note felt like a hammer striking my skull. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for the darkness behind my eyelids to offer some refuge, some quiet. But the darkness was not empty. It was filled with flashes of memory, jagged and bright. I flashed back to the morning, standing before the full-length mirror in my bedroom, the pink dress zipping up, the hair perfectly curled, the makeup flawless, hiding the dark circles. I had looked at that girl in the mirror and commanded her, "You will handle this. You will smile. You will be normal." But now, sliding down the wall of a university hallway, I accepted the truth. I am not normal. I am not like them. I forced myself to move. One step. The click of my heels on the linoleum echoed like gunshots in the empty space. Click, click. It sounded too loud, dangerously loud. I was terrified someone would hear, that a door would open and I would be exposed, a weeping, trembling mess in a couture dress. I couldn't bear the thought of being seen. Not now. I reached the exit at the end of the hall. The heavy door bar yielded under my hand, and I stumbled out into the night. The contrast was immediate. The night air was cool and crisp. Above the campus, the North Carolina sky was a vast ink-black dome, scattered with brilliant stars. In the parking lot, cars were decorated with class of 2024 paint and balloons that bobbed listlessly in the breeze. It was peaceful, but I couldn't access the peace. I collapsed onto the concrete steps of the side entrance. I wrapped my arms around my knees, burying my face in the expensive silk, and tried to rock myself into calmness. But the panic held on. It was inside me, a beast that had finally broken its chains. Why can't I just be normal? I whispered into my knees. The words tasted like ash. I felt the hot sting of tears spilling over, ruining the makeup I had applied so carefully. I tried to stop them, but the dam had broken. I sobbed, my shoulders shaking, alone in the dark. Then the door behind me clicked open. I jumped, my whole body seizing with terror. I expected a classmate, a drunk student, someone who would laugh or stare. I wiped my face frantically, but it wasn't a student. It was Dr. Richardson, my psychology professor. He was the faculty supervisor for the event, a quiet, observant man with graying hair and kind eyes. Madison, his voice was soft, non-threatening. He stepped onto the landing. "Are you all right?" I opened my mouth to deliver the standard lie. "I'm fine, just a headache." But the words wouldn't come. I couldn't do it anymore. I just shook my head, a mute admission of defeat. He didn't rush me. He didn't panic. He didn't ask intrusive questions. He simply sat down on the step next to me, not too close, leaving me my space. He sighed, looking out at the parking lot, offering me his calm presence as an anchor. He placed a hand gently on his own knee, a gesture of grounding. "You know," he said, his voice low and measured, piercing through the noise of my panic, "you are not obligated to be happy just because everyone else is. You don't have to perform for them." He paused, letting the words settle. "Sometimes," he continued, "being honest with yourself, admitting that you are not okay, is the first actual step toward healing." Those words hit me harder than the loud music, harder than the blinding lights. I turned to look at him through my blurred vision. He wasn't looking at a student who was failing graduation. He was seeing me, not the girl pretending to be strong in a pink dress, but the real me, broken, terrified, trembling, but undeniably alive. And in that moment of being truly seen, the grip of the panic began to loosen. It didn't vanish, but the vice around my chest eased just a fraction. "I can't go back in," I whispered. "Then don't," he said simply. I sat there beside him, and for the first time all evening, I felt air enter my lungs. the world stopped spinning. This was the climax, not a grand explosion, but a quiet realization on a concrete step. I cannot be part of their picture, but I can still be part of life. I remained there on the steps, my arms still locked around my knees, but the weeping had subsided into sporadic shuddering breaths. Beside me sat Professor Richardson, the man who famously told his frantic freshmen, "Psychology isn't about memorizing textbooks, it's about understanding the narrative of your own life." He didn't fill the silence with platitudes. He didn't tell me to cheer up. He just sat there, witnessing my pain without judging it. And that witnessing was everything. "You know, Madison," he said, tilting his head to look up at the constellation of Orion above the library tower, "graduation isn't about the photographs. It's not about the party. It's about the threshold. It's about deciding you are ready to walk forward, even if your walk looks different from everyone else's." I listened to the cadence of his voice, and I felt a shift in the tectonic plates of my mind. I realized I had been trying to force myself into a mold that didn't fit. I didn't have to be in the group photo. I didn't have to smile for the camera. I had the right to be exactly where I was, sitting on the dirty steps, mascara running down my cheeks, surviving. Inside the hall, the party raged on. I could hear the DJ shouting, the roar of approval from the crowd. Cameras were flashing, immortalizing smiles that would fade by morning. But I no longer felt the desperate pull to be among them. I stayed with the professor until the energy inside began to wane. We talked not about the trauma, not yet, but about books, about the future, about the fact that sometimes the most pivotal moments of our lives happen in the quiet margins, not on the center stage. When the event began to break up, I stood. My dress was wrinkled, my hair wind-blown. I walked home alone through the quiet streets of the college town. The dress was still on me, but the magical thinking was gone. It wasn't armor anymore. It wasn't a savior. It was just a piece of pink silk. And I was just Madison. I walked into my apartment, unzipped the dress, and let it fall to the floor. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in 2 years. The fear was still there, lurking, but something had changed. I couldn't carry the silence anymore. The weight of it was crushing me. I picked up my phone. My fingers trembled as I dialed the number for the campus counseling center, a number I had looked at 100 times but never called. "Hello," I said, my voice shaking but audible. I I need to make an appointment. I need to talk to someone about something that happened. It was terrifying. My heart hammered against my ribs. Still, I saw my mother talking to a rest of the crime, from personal feelings, aides, terrors, roles and rogues. "Wait, suck me out. Do you want me to make this from a different culture that makes you feel weird?" I started therapy that week. I began the slow, agonizing work of learning to trust again. I learned to articulate the shape of my pain. I learned to accept that the trauma was a chapter in my book, but it didn't have to be the title of the story. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, I began to feel lighter. Not the fake lightness of the dress, but a real, grounded freedom. Graduation became a marker in my timeline. Not because it was a celebration, and not because it was a finale, but because it was the night I stopped running. It was the beginning of the long walk home. I often travel back in my mind to that night. I revisit the texture of the cold concrete steps, the vastness of the North Carolina sky, the weight of the professor's hand on my shoulder. That was the moment I stopped performing. That was the moment I allowed myself to be human. Not perfect, not strong, not the girl who bounced back, just me. After graduation, I realized that silence is not a shelter, it is a prison. I couldn't spend the rest of my life pretending the storm wasn't raging just because the sun was shining for everyone else. That realization was the first brick in the foundation of my recovery. I started speaking, first with my therapist, stumbling over words, weeping until I was empty, then with my mother, sitting at her kitchen table, then with the friends I had pushed away. I stopped hiding my panic attacks. I stopped feeling shame for my flinching. I realized that these reactions didn't make me weak. They were proof that I had survived something terrible and I was still standing. They made me alive. It wasn't a movie montage. It was hard work. There were setbacks. I had to relearn how to breed. I had to relearn how to occupy space in a room. I had to learn to say no, when I was overwhelmed, and help when I was drowning. But step by step, I began to feel the trauma losing its absolute monarchy over my life. It still visited, yes, but I knew now that I wasn't fighting it alone. I had allies. I had people who saw the real Madison. I had the right to be broken and the right to heal at my own pace. Now, I look at the photos from that graduation night on social media. I see my friends smiling, arms linked, frozen in perfect joy, and I am not there. There is a gap where I should be. And you know what? I don't regret it, not for a second, because that photograph would have been a lie. It would have been a mask. My true memory of that night is the quiet on the steps, the conversation with Dr. Richardson, and the profound, terrifying relief of finally exhaling. So I want to ask you, you listening to this right now, how many times have you put on a mask for the sake of others? How many times have you laughed when you wanted to scream? How many times have you worn the dress hoping it would fix what is broken inside? And how many more times are you willing to do it? My story taught me one undeniable truth. A photograph can be empty, but a life, a real, messy, painful, beautiful life, never is. Uh, The moral of this story is simple. Don't be afraid to be real. That is where your true power lies.